Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our per capita webinar today. It's very lovely to see you all piling into our webinar and into the chat there. Our conversation today is with Dr. Ramona I said I wouldn't get this wrong, Vijeyarasa, who has written a really fascinating work that she's going to discuss with us today. But I'd like to start by introducing myself to those of you I haven't met already. My name's Emma Dawson, and I'm the Executive Director here at Per Capita, here at home today, working from home. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the elders of the people of the Bunurong Nation, of the Kulin Nation, the land on which from which I come to you today. Pay my respects to their elders past and present, and thank them for their custodianship of the lands and waters on which we live, lands which were never ceded. This is a really important and dear to my heart subject today. Both Ramona and I are fellows. I'm a new fellow at the Women's Leadership Institute of Australia. And the book that she's here to talk to us about today makes a real difference to the way that we understand women's leadership in the region, in Australia, in our region, and internationally. And critically, what Ramona has done with this work is, rather than focus on the absence of women leaders in our body politic around the world, she's looked at what the presence of women leaders do and how that has an impact on legal and human rights and engagement and political leadership for women across the board. It is a really fascinating read, and I do encourage you all to take a look at it. We will put information up for you so that you can access it. I will do a little bit of housekeeping and say that we are recording today's webinar. It will be available through the usual Per Capita channels after we have our live presentation today. If you would like to put a question to Ramona, please put your question in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to get to as many of those questions as I can towards the end of our time together today. But first, Ramona, please, thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation, and congratulations on a really impressive piece of work. Not only is this a masterful look at women's leadership in the region, but Ramona is also the Chief Investigator behind the Gender Legislative Index, which is an entirely new data set that she has developed that helps us understand the impact of different legislative agendas and legislative moves on gender. What brought you to write this incredible work? And the research behind it must have been quite intensive.
Well, first, let me say thank you, Emma, and to Per Capita for hosting today's conversation. And I'm really pleased to join from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation here in Ultimo in Sydney, where the land was never ceded. It's a pleasure to be talking about my new book, The Woman President. As Emma, you just mentioned, it was a long journey, 5 years from research to print this book took, and I'm happy to talk about what that research journey was like. I suppose in terms of motivation, I've been very privileged in my life to spend a decade before I returned to academia working in civil society. And in that time, I met many women from very diverse countries as diverse as Brazil and Cambodia and Liberia, really struggling for their rights and for change. And I have seen really strong conversations in some of those countries around gender-based violence or women's rights to formal equality in the workplace. What I'm surprised by is how little progress we've made when it comes to women's leadership and women's occupation of politics, and particularly women's occupation at the highest level of executive leadership. So as this book goes to print, there are only 30 presidents and prime ministers that are female around the entire world. And that includes women who occupy that position where there are both presidents and prime ministers. So an extremely low number when you're talking about 200 countries or so worldwide. And, I think we need to keep talking about this absence of women at that level of leadership. Some of those of us joining us today would have seen the picture of the G7 not that long ago. It was a lineup of men alongside female president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And women will constantly be absent from these global meetings if we don't have more women occupying these executive roles. Having said that, I think we spent so long focusing on women's absence from executive office that we haven't spent enough time talking about women's presence and what happens when women make it to the position of president or prime minister. Because I do think something unique happens when women occupy these roles. My research has shown that more resources are mobilised and positive investments are made in women-friendly outcomes. So I suppose the activist in me wants to contribute in some way to driving up the numbers, but the academic in me wanted to produce, an evidence-based study of both the good and the limitations of what these women were able to do for fellow women's lives.
And you've done that remarkably well, I think, and in a way that is quite innovative and a new approach to these issues that we haven't seen, as you said, nearly enough of. You've focused particularly on women from our region, or from the Asian region, and those 4 examples that you've explored in detail in your book. And one of the things that I enjoyed so much about the book, as I said when we were talking previously, is so much of our debate around women's leadership is drawn from Europe and from the US, and not from our own region. What made you focus on our region in particular?
Well, I think you've nailed it, Emma. You know, we do a lot of theorising from the standpoint of Europe and North America, and yet the Asia region has had this remarkably high number of women occupy executive office, and also is a region where there are vibrant women's movements. And I think there's a very interesting engagement, which I talk about in the book, between women's movements and women in presidential positions. So Asia offers a really interesting lens, if there is even such a thing as Asia as we classify, because they're such distinct countries that I looked at. So I did study 4 women presidents from the Philippines, Corazon Aquino and Macapagal Arroyo, Indonesia's first and only female president, President Megawati, and then Sri Lanka's Chandrika Bandaranaike. And I suppose, you know, Sri Lanka offers a particularly interesting example. When I talk about the research journey, I am of Sri Lankan origin. So it was particularly wonderful to go to Sri Lanka and interview activists and former cabinet members, members of parliament, and scholars in the region to talk about politics then and now, and to really explore women's leadership in a country that had the first ever female elected head of government. Sirimavo Bandaranaike, who was elected in 1960 when her husband was assassinated, and when she decided to run. You know, we never look enough at countries in the global south as leading the world and having the world's first, and Sri Lanka did. And so it was a particularly important addition to the study, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's what really hit me out front when I first read the book and saw the case studies that you'd chosen, because not only do they broaden our understanding of women's leadership away from that very Eurocentric, Anglo-centric approach, but they inform us about different cultures and how they view women's leadership differently, and how it's, I think, in many ways, not as confronting in those societies, or not as controversial in those societies for the same reasons that it certainly is particularly in the US and Australia, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, you think about the US has never had a female president. So, you know, there's a lot to be learned when we look beyond those borders. I suppose what I also find really interesting is how striking, though, some of the global similarities are around the troubled pathway women have to walk into executive office. And I call this in the book the gender being a double-edged sword, because obviously it can work to women's advantage. We saw in the federal election in Australia how women's vote really swayed the outcomes of that election. And it's very similar at the presidential level. In the Philippines, when Corazon Aquino was campaigning in 1986, the women mobilized around her and they formed the Corey's Crusaders, and people describe the time as one of Corey mania. You know, the women's vote is very significant, and yet the expectations a lot of women wear on their shoulders as a result, these leaders would bear on their shoulders to do more for women, is onerous at the same time. But in terms of one of those global similarities, I was sitting in the office of the executive director of a women's movement in Sri Lanka, and she actually knew Chandrika Bandaranaike quite well during her leadership, and she turned to me and said, and then the woman cut her hair. She cut her hair and she stopped being the image of the strong Asian woman. And I remember just thinking back to our former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, and the amount of attention in the media to what she was wearing and her haircut of the day. And I thought, wow, there are remarkable global similarities in terms of what women struggle to overcome when they do finally make it to that nation's top job.
Yeah, I think that the concept of the double-edged sword that you explain in the book and how common that is across cultures was really quite confronting. I mean, not surprising, but when you explore it in the depth that you have, and to understand that women, can you expand on that a little bit so that you explain? I don't want to take over and explain your book for you. That while their gender can be a benefit to them, to their political career, to them connecting with a broad constituency, half the population, but it can also hold them back in many ways. And then you also go on to explain that they have quite a mixed record on gender outcomes, that just because a woman leader is a woman, or that doesn't necessarily mean that you always see the best outcomes in terms of gender legislation.
Yeah, sure, Emma. So I'll start with the double-edged sword. So you put it, as I do in the book, I discuss it as an opportunity to aid women's rise to leadership as well as a challenge. And I can offer another example, the way in which women use their gender to garner votes. We have to remember that the countries under study, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, were undergoing democratic transitions or exiting periods of extensive civil war. And so there is a desire for something different that women can present to the table. Corazon Aquino described herself as a crusading housewife in a den of thieves. You know, I love that language from her speech, because people wanted to overcome the corruption under the dictator that Marcos had been. And a corruption is a really interesting example, because women are assumed to be less corrupt and less vulnerable to abusing their political power. And it has assisted these women to rise. But I think at the same time, and this is where the double-edged sword plays out, it can easily be used against them if there are corruption cases, which inevitably there are going to be. So Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo led the Philippines in the first decade of the 2000s. And in 2004 was recorded over telephone trying to engineer the election. And I suppose the disappointing part is that when I returned to the Philippines, I was an activist there many years ago to conduct these interviews, that election scandal was foremost on the minds of most people I spoke with, despite the fact that she actually did quite a lot for the country and quite a lot for women in terms of legislation. And so I think the disappointment, or the fall from grace, to use that phrase, is even greater, because the expectation of the clean and incorrupt woman is so great. But it does aid that rise in the first place. And then in terms of, like I mentioned, Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo did have an interesting and a relatively positive track record on women's lives. And that's what I'm able to explore in the book, the legislative footprint of these women leaders, and did so in a way that showed both the positives and the negatives. I think we would imagine very easily a country like the Philippines, where women's reproductive rights is a subject of debate. It carries a lot of the model of the US, and everybody, if you weren't familiar before with the overturning of the constitutional right to abortion in the US now, I think everyone's very clear on how easily women's bodies are the subject of political debate. And unfortunately, under both Presidents Aquino and Macapagal-Arroyo, it was quite clear that it's no different under a woman leader, that, the body is still sacrificed to the patriarchy. And yet there were also many positive returns to women's lives. And I think there was a remarkable example of positive enactment of laws to combat gender-based violence in all three countries in a 2-year period. So from 2004 to 2005, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia all enacted their first ever standalone law on gender-based violence against women. And I think that's a remarkable coincidence when 3 women happen to be in power. But you can also interrogate what that case study means in terms of the women's movements very quickly mobilizing resources to lobby those leaders to bring about change, because there was a window of opportunity when the woman was heading the nation to get those laws passed. The women's vote became a negotiating tool, and women's movements came to a consensus so they could present one bill to the leader to get passed during their tenures. So by comparison, Indonesia's Elimination of Violence in the Household Act took 7 years to pass. The marriage law, which also gave women many rights in divorce around assets and property, was negotiated over 75 years. So I do think laws are enacted at a faster pace when these women leaders made it to executive office.
And that's really fascinating to compare to our experience here in Australia. I couldn't help thinking this the whole way while reading your book, is that we didn't see that same. We've had one, female prime minister in Australia, but we didn't really see at that time the same kind of momentum and speed on women's issues. We're actually seeing that after this election. And we're talking today on a day where the Parliament has just passed a law for, providing, enshrining 10 days of family and domestic violence leave in the National Employment Standards. And why do you think, if you have a view, and I'm springing this on you, I'm sorry, question without notice, that in my view, we didn't see that same rush of women's organisations taking advantage of Julia Gillard's Prime Minister to push, other than perhaps the increase to the SHADS award and the payment for increased income for services workers. But there wasn't at the time the same momentum that we've seen in Australia behind women's issues over the last 2 to 3 years. It almost seems an inverse of what happened in the countries you studied.
Well, I think, paid parental leave is a very, paid domestic violence leave is a very interesting example, because in fact, the Philippines introduced 10 days of paid leave for victims of domestic violence under Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo in 2004.
Yeah.
So we're talking 18 years later, it took for Australia to get here. And I think it is worth a conversation around learning from our near neighbours about good practice legislation. Why did it not happen under Julia Gillard? You know, it's all speculative. But what I think is really evident in these three countries are very vibrant, very strong women's movements. And I think in Australia, a lot of us in this space have seen that vibrancy after Brittany Higgins and others have so bravely come out and told their stories in the last couple of years. And I think that's why we were able to mobilise and utilise this election better than we ever have in the past. With so many women entering Parliament now, we've got 19 new members for the first time, female members in the House. That's very significant. And I think if we want to see the kind of legislative reform we need to see in this country, we better learn from those neighbours and mobilise resources and use the window of opportunity that those women in politics could present for some law reform. And perhaps we didn't realise there was such a window of opportunity before and didn't make as much use of it. And perhaps part of that also sits on our former Prime Minister as well. I suppose there's multiple players in this legislative reform process.
Yeah, I mean, I should be generous and say that we did get paid parental leave under the Gillard government. That was, you know, quite a step forward. But then we also saw things like single mothers being pushed onto job seekers. So it wasn't, I think, until Gillard made her misogyny speech that sort of planted a seed that really, as you say, came to fruition over the last 2 to 3 years here.
I think as you say, to the credit that we did introduce the paid parental leave scheme and the dad and partner pay 2 years later. And of course, we can compare that to what other countries offer overseas and how we can do better. For example, the Philippines introduced their paid parental leave scheme under Corazon Aquino in 1992.
Right.
Again, a remarkable comparison. But I think it goes back to this double-edged sword because of the weight that women bear, where so quickly, when they make it to executive office, their bodies become the subject of debate instead of them being the subjects of the political process and able to do what they've planned to do in getting to executive office. I think it's the perfect example of why it's important to push more women up that pathway. You know, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard said when she left, it won't be easy for the next female Prime Minister, but it will be easier. And I think the pathway in countries like the Philippines that have had 2 women leaders and Sri Lanka that have had 2 women leaders, it can only be an easier pathway where those conversations are reduced in number and more time can be spent on the political agenda instead of the fact of having a woman leader.
Yes, and commenting on her clothes and her hair and so on. So I'm just going to reach out to the audience again and say, if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A. We will get to them in a few minutes when we've finished having this chat ourselves, but it's a really fascinating subject. I'm sure you've all got a lot to ask. You referred earlier to the contrast between Sri Lankan politics at the time that you were studying and that period and what's going on today. And I don't think we can pass up the fact that Sri Lanka is currently going through significant political turmoil. Do you have a view on how Sri Lankan politics has evolved in the period since you were studying, and whether or not having more female leadership because obviously it's a corruption issue as much as anything else, and a feeling that the economy has been badly managed by people feathering their own nests. It sounds slightly familiar to Australians perhaps after the last few years. Do you have a view about the current role of women politicians and women leaders in Sri Lanka and how that might ameliorate or affect the current situation there?
So Sri Lankan politics, like many other countries in the region, to be honest, this is a very elite space. Yeah. And so really there's been 2 families dominating Sri Lankan politics for many years. That has changed in recent times where other parties have risen, but you still see the Rajapaksas as a family dominating the political space. Look, I can compare it to the time when Chandrika Bandaranaike was in power. She ruled for 11 years, and comparisons are obviously difficult because there's many different variables. But those 11 years in Sri Lanka were periods of relative stability. She did have a corruption case against her, and the Supreme Court found that there was a land acquisition during her time that shouldn't have taken place. Having said that, in those 11 years, she said sorry for the conflict, and we all know how significant an apology from government is. She stood by mass graves when she really came to power as the peace president trying to end the civil war. Thousands of families received reparation, although mostly low-level army officials were the ones who were accused of the mass murders in that time on both sides during the civil war in Sri Lanka. But it was a period of relative stability during that time, and that's certainly far from what we have today. There are very few women in Sri Lankan politics compared to other nations in the world. So prior to a 2018 local government quota, there were only 5% of local government members in Sri Lanka who were women. It had one of the lowest rates in the world, so shockingly low for a very educated population. Post the local government level quota, the number's risen to about 25%. But the tendency is for the women to be put into those positions, to be nominated by families and not necessarily with the political skills and the support or valued in what they can do in that role. So I think Sri Lanka in terms of politics has a very long way to go. I'm working on a project with some partners in Colombo, the International Centre for Ethnic Studies, on a project just trying to do this, get more grassroots and activist women into that political space. And there is a lot of advocacy around trying to get the quota to the district and national level as well, because there has to be a shift. I mean, it's a disgusting example of abuse of governance, poor governance, and Sri Lankans suffering as a result. And, you know, it's interesting too that a lot of the commissions around corruption that Chandrika Bandaranaike instituted during her leadership were immediately removed with a constitutional amendment by the president that followed. So I think it's also a good reminder that even when we have a president that has a positive legislative footprint, sometimes those positive gains are quickly lost.
Absolutely. And we've found, I think, similar things around the world over many years, and your book demonstrates that. I wanted to go to what is going to be, I hope, a long-lasting legacy of your work on not just this book, but you have developed and used throughout your analysis an entirely new tool, a new data set, effectively the Gender Legislative Index, which the intention of which, and you're now the chief investigator behind this ongoing work, is it's a tool that, as you say, is designed to promote the enactment of legislation that works more effectively to improve women's lives around the world. And this obviously will have life beyond the book. And as someone that has spent the last few years investigating why Australia has fallen so far on international global rankings and how the effect of legislation and parliamentary decisions impact women's lives, can you explain a bit to our audience about the index and how it was developed and how you hope it will work in future?
Sure, I would love to. So the Gender Legislative Index, it is a public tool. You can look at it in your own time, genderlawindex.org. You know, effectively, when I set out to evaluate the impact of these women leaders on women's lives, I found no tool to actually analyse, is this law a good law for women? So there are a lot of indices around the world. I know, Emma, you write about this a lot, that tell us where countries rank in gender equality. Even the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law Index points out which countries are doing better when it comes to law and women's rights. But those indices don't allow us to actually evaluate, is this law a good for women, and what about its provisions make it positive or negative? And so I created that in the Gender Legislative Index. To keep it really simple, there are 7 questions that are derived from the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I think every legislator should ask those 7 questions every time a bill is enacted. And human evaluators use those 7 questions to evaluate the provisions of a law and find it either on a scale from gender responsive to gender regressive. And they also provide an overall score for the law. There's a machine learning component that I hope removes some of the human bias we bring when evaluating a law. We tend to be harsher as experts in the field on a gender-based violence law than we're looking at gender and tax, for example. And so the machine learning provides an overall score regardless of where the law was enacted and what's the subject matter. And so I now have this tool that has a life beyond the book. And I've been able to use it to evaluate some of the laws enacted in Australia, which is why I think paid parental leave is such an interesting example. It scores partially meeting international standards on the index because we can do so much better. You know, so in Australia, we've got a combined 20 weeks of paid parental leave. The OECD average for paid parental leave is 51 weeks. And we know good practice tells us that fathers in heterosexual couples will take leave if there's a use it or lose it scheme. And Australia, under our proposed enhanced parental leave scheme, is suggesting that we leave it up to partners in a heterosexual couple to decide whether the father or mother will take that leave. And we know that's not good practice. And so a tool like the Gender Legislative Index can help countries like Australia evaluate our laws, find out where they sit on this scale from meeting international standards to disregard of international standards, and to find the examples of good practice for us to model our law reform on. If I can, I'll add 2 more things about the Gender Legislative Index. I was very privileged to be invited by the independent MP Ruth Forrest from Tasmania. So Ruth has used the Gender Legislative Index to push forward a motion in Tasmanian Parliament, which was successful, to call for a Gender Equality Audit Committee. And I think it would come as a surprise to many, perhaps it doesn't, that Australian parliaments don't have gender equality audit committees to audit legislation, to audit bills, to see whether they're going to be positive or negative on women's lives. How will women's lived experience change as a result of law? So Tasmania has now a standalone Gender Equality Audit Committee. The ACT has an Economic and Gender Equality Committee. And I think this is a space to watch, because those committees can use tools like the Gender Legislative Index and the criteria in the index to evaluate, what is this bill going to do? And is this something we want to be passing? I think what's also interesting about the Gender Legislative Index is it calls for this gender lens to areas of law that we often don't think about from a women's rights perspective. You know, as someone who was an advocate for many years, I can say firsthand how important law reform for gender-based violence and women's reproductive rights is. These are fundamental issues for women's everyday lives. But if we don't build gender expertise across taxation or corruption or climate or financial services or corporate law, we are doing women a disservice. Women are not invited to the table, and we're enacting laws that are gender blind because they just don't have that gender lens. And I think, you know, that's what I found to be, again, an interesting finding in the book. President Magawati made a concerted effort to establish a corruption eradication commission. And, you know, we can only assume that corruption affects women in a different way. And there are a growing number of studies. If you just simply think about a reduction in government resources, that means a reduction in public services, which is going to be hardest felt by poor women, low-income women, women single heads of households, sole income earners, and how they raise families in that capacity. When it comes to an issue like climate change, President Kumaratunga, at the tail end of her legacy, had to deal with the Asian tsunami. So this was many years ago, and I think it was really remarkable that even at a time where we didn't know that much about bringing a gendered lens to climate and disaster risk reduction and management, she appointed women to all levels of management committees. She targeted widows and made sure women had livelihood assistance. And that's the kind of gender lens we need to issues where we're often not bringing that gender perspective. And I hope the Gender Legislative Index really calls for that sort of analysis.
I think it's so timely, Ramona, because we do have a government that is expressing some interest in these issues now. We have a Minister for Women who's also the Finance Minister and has made an explicit commitment to, for example, applying gender lens to our budget processes. But what your work does is really broaden that concept of what a woman's issue is. And gender lens budgeting is great, right? It's not specifically about what's seen as women's issues, but actually we should, as we introduce, as all cabinet submissions in Australia, for example, are required to have a competition impact statement and a regional impact statement. What your tool would allow us to do is to have that kind of gender lens over all legislation and ensure that we consider the impact of any policy on women and of people of all genders. So it's an incredibly timely piece of work, and I do have some confidence that it may be adopted at a federal level under this current government. I certainly hope so.
Let's hope so. And I think it's about opening up that conversation to how a diversity of people experience legislation, because obviously women alone are not the subjects of marginalisation and inequality. And it's not just about being a woman, but other identities, and thinking about women of linguistic diversity and how they're affected by legislation, women in rural and remote communities, especially in times of climate change and what we're going through in this country. And so it invites that conversation. You know, I, for so long, have assumed that women are not legislators, but women are making it into Parliament. Then I assume, well, women aren't part of Parliamentary Council, who turn a government policy into the legalese. But if you look at the statistics, in Australia, in New South Wales, where I'm based, and federally, around 70% of the staff who occupy Parliamentary Council are women. So it's not an assumption that a woman at the table alone will make the difference. It's about educating those who have the tools and the power in their hands to bring that gender lens and aiding them with how they can do that.
Yeah, and I think what this tool is going to make, there will be no excuse really for not doing that when this tool has been developed. So thank you. It really is fascinating. I put the link to the Gender Legislative Index in our chat. So if you go into the chat box, you will see it there. But the questions are filling up in the Q&A. So I'm actually going to proceed to start asking a few questions from the audience. Otherwise, we may not get through them all. This is from an anonymous attendee, the person who at the start kindly let me know that we were on air. Can you compare Australia to the rest of Asia Asia, and where do we currently stand, both in terms of our, that's the question, but I will clarify it further to say both in terms of our representation of women, but also our approach to considering gender lenses through legislative process.
That's a really great question. So a few things I can say is I'm sure the audience is very familiar with this. I know Emma is, but the World Economic Forum releases the Global Gender Gap Index more or less every year since 2006. And Australia fell from a ranking of 15th in 2006 to 50th last year and 43rd this year. So we've been on a downhill trajectory. And I think it's important to understand what that statistic means. It doesn't mean that Australia is women in Australia are worse off than a woman in Zimbabwe or the Philippines or Albania, all of whom rank ahead of us. The index measures the differentials in equality. So it means that a woman is less equal to a man. The inequality gap between a woman and a man in Australia is bigger than the inequality gap in those countries that rank ahead of us. So the Philippines, for example, ranks 19th, just as an example, since you would like a comparison to Asia, and we're 43rd. And so our inequality gap between men and women here is higher. In terms of what's pulling us down, and this also goes to the question around where do we stand for political participation, if you look at the statistics, we actually do quite well in terms of educational attainment and health and wellbeing on this particular index. Where we fall down is political participation. And I think that will change slightly after the most recent election, although we can't assume gains will be sustained, because it's about long term and really changing the workplace culture in Parliament so that more women want to run and contest. Because just prior to this election, YouGov did a survey of women aged 18 to 25 and found that around 18% of those women think that Australian women don't get a fair go in politics. And that's the future women who are going to run, especially as we're seeing younger women run for politics now, which is wonderful. But if those women don't think women get a fair go, then it's hard for them to put their hand up. So I think political participation is really pulling us down. Another thing that's pulling us down, which is related, is the fact that we've only ever had one woman leader. And some of the countries that rank quite well, relatively well, get pulled up because they've had more. So Bangladesh, for example, is the only country in the world that has had a woman in leadership for more years than a man in the last half century. So, you know, these are not countries where I'm saying women are necessarily better off than women in Australia, but I think it's important for us not to assume that all the global good practice lies in the north. You know, on paid parental leave, definitely the leaders are Nordic countries. They're doing far better in terms of shared care and enjoying the benefits of shared care. But I think in this region, there's very good examples of good laws around standalone laws on gender-based violence against women, workplace equality, paid domestic violence leave coming in many years ago, gender responsive budgeting out of the Philippines, which introduced it when we first had women's budget statements in the 1990s and have maintained that approach to budgeting. And so I think there is a lot of good practice in the region for us to learn from.
There is, absolutely. And what your book does is really highlight that we overlook this so much. I just clarify as well that when you look at the Global Gender Gap Index, or when you look at any of the UN measures, Australia obviously performs very well in terms of standards of living overall in our region. So as you said, we're not suggesting that the women in Australia are much worse off than a lot of other women in our region, but relatively, while our standard of living is very, very high, the gap between men and women's experience is much greater. So you made that point earlier, but I just wanted to re-emphasize that.
And you can also add that, you know, in terms of our standing in the OECD says that Australia is the 9th richest country in the world based on GDP per capita. Yep. So we also have the resources to do better. Yes. And so to me, it is a question of political priority. It's not that we can't afford to make the kind of investments we need to make so that, you know, women and a diversity of people enjoy what Australia has to offer.
No, and we have, you know, that's why it's really no excuse that we have such a meagre paid parental leave scheme in this country. Reason Australia has posed a question, 30 women, which I think says 30 women compared to how many men. I think that relates to their current parliamentary makeup. And I'll just throw out that the House is now 38% female and the Senate is 57%. But this is very unevenly distributed between the parties. If you think about what's happened in the House of Representatives, we have 7 new independent MPs who are all women who all defeated men from the coalition. So there is one side of politics really dragging its feet on gender equal representation in this country.
I actually think that question was a reference to the 30 women who are currently presidents or prime ministers.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All around the world.
So
and it is
actual question.
and it is important to have a comparator. So that's around 30 women presidents and prime ministers from around 200 countries. Many countries in the world have dual executive systems. So we're talking around 230 to 240 positions, and only 30 occupied by women. So it can tell you how poor this is. It really is one of the lowest performers in terms of progress towards equity in numbers. So Moldova and Barbados are the only two countries in the world that have a dual executive system where currently women hold both roles of president and prime minister. And there are great examples. Sanna Marin of Finland is leading there. She was one of the youngest women to occupy executive office around the world. And there's a 5-party coalition government, all led by women. But again, these are examples you can pull out because they stand out among such a troublesome global context. And of course, this might change depending on the Tory vote in the UK and Italy's vote too in their September election. So we might get up to 32 in a couple of months, but the progress is incredibly slow.
It is incredibly slow. We, of course, had that briefly here when we had Quentin Bryce as our Governor-General and Julia Gillard as our Prime Minister. And I'd just also point out that Finland, as you mentioned there, with 5 parties led by women, is introducing a 4-day week, which is fascinating to me because all of my research shows that that's one of the best things you can do in order to balance paid and unpaid care work between men and women. So I think it is interesting, and I'm going to be following that with great interest. Eva Cox is with us as always, and it would not be appropriate for us to have a conversation about women in politics without taking a question from Eva, which she's posed here in the Q&A. Eva says, is there a danger that strong women may have difficulties with other women, including some feminist groups, because they are not soft and nice? I've had some such experience with this, some flack and know of others have, Eva says. What do you think about that, and what did your research possibly show?
Well, I love that question, Eva, and thank you for joining today. It's lovely to have you here alongside the rest of the audience. Look, I would talk about the Philippines, where I think, there's such a vibrant women's movement, and there are figures that really stand out, very vocal figures. And people look back today, both positively and negatively, about these women who particularly led the way. But I suppose what was particularly nice about what these women managed to do is the negotiation around law reform. And I think this is a lesson for us as well, that now that we have this window of opportunity to try to come to a common ground, because it's not as if feminists are a monolithic group either. And, when I mentioned the UK and Italy, we also need to think about conservative women who also have a place in this conversation. And so if you look at the Philippines, there were some really standout, very vocal women, in Indonesia as well, who really welcomed me into their rooms to have these conversations. And what I found that they were able to do was to bring both sides of the women's movement, or the multiple sides of the women's movement, together to negotiate over law reform. And I saw that negotiation over laws on gender-based violence, on the gender equality quota in Indonesia, because there wasn't common agreement about what would be the best thing for women, what kind of numbers would be the target, whether this was the kind of law reform women should be pursuing in the first place. But when the negotiations happened behind the scenes, it meant the women's movement was able to present a united front, at least for that law. And I think that's key to that successful enactment of legislation, because they're not coming to the woman leader divided, because divided, it makes it too easy to knock women back. But they were able to come with a united front. And I credit some of those very wonderful, loud and committed feminists who actually led some of those negotiations in the first place. But I think that there was a lot of interesting examples about negotiation as a key tactic towards law reform.
A question from Yolanda Vega. Hi, Yolanda. Good to have you with us. And I think you touched on this earlier when you talked about Tasmania, but she says, who's currently using the Gender Legislative Index?
Thank you, Yolanda. Lovely question. Nice to have you here too. So I was very privileged to attend the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians annual event. So their annual conference was in Brisbane last year. It was cancelled, unfortunately, with COVID. And it was a real privilege to sit in beautiful Queensland Parliament. It is a truly beautiful building with women from independents and women from Labor and Liberal to talk about the Gender Legislative Index. And, by the end of a one-day meeting together with these women who are sitting in state and federal parliaments, they now have the tools in their hands to use the index. And I think we really came to a point where we discussed its multiple uses and felt its ideal purpose would be before a bill even gets tabled. So these questions, these criteria need to be asked when a party is proposing legislative reform, when the idea or policy position is being discussed. Because once you have a bill tabled, it's much harder to start shifting that language. So it has many different places to be used, but we came to an outcome at the end of that meeting with women sitting in Parliament that its best place is at a very early stage in the conversation, so that gender lens is passed before the debate is even opened. Of course, it can then be used to review bills themselves. I'm currently working to review the Modern Slavery Act, which is a federal law that was enacted in 2018 and is currently under review using the Gender Legislative Index. So I suppose it says it's never too late to apply a gender lens when law is being reviewed. And that's a good opportunity as well to propose a gender lens to what is in fact a very gender blind law. So I hope, Yolanda, it's serving those multiple purposes, but I think Tasmanian Parliament is probably the best example of it actually being used to push forward the motion in the first place.
As I said, I think it's going to be an increasingly valuable and increasingly used tool. And Karen Aguilera asks us what is being done to get this index into the criteria for federal legislation. Are we, currently engaged with MPs, and certainly federally? It's, as I said earlier, an opportunity.
Well, hopefully early next year, I'll be going to meet with the Friends of Parliament down in Canberra. It's one of the questions you asked before around whether we could have seen more during the time of former Prime Minister Julia Gillard. And I've been asked this in comparative terms to the countries in the study. And I suppose there is something to be said about party politics in Australia. So when I have these conversations, it's remarkable how divided the situation is here. So I do tend to talk to a primarily Liberal audience on one day about its tool. I tend to talk to a very Labor independent audience on another day, and that's just the reality. But I think it's about seeing how a gender lens can benefit a diversity of women, that progressive and conservative women have women's interests, and that needs to be represented. And this kind of gender lensing that the Gender Legislative Index can allow is to speak to a very wide variety of women's interests. And the conversation is happening at that level.
It's great to know. And I think one of the issues, I'm part of a newly formed alliance, low-paid women and gender diverse people's alliance, that is trying to develop ways of engaging with the federal government around some of the issues that really affect the women that don't get talked about enough. And one of the great things about your book is you've taken such a broad view of women's issues. But in Australia in particular, and in Western countries, particularly English-speaking countries, over the last 20 to 30 years, feminism has tended to be a message that's confined very much to middle-class women, to leadership, women in positions of leadership. With the upcoming Jobs Summit here in Australia, we have a stream in that summit that's focused on women's employment and women's economic participation. And one of the questions, again from our anonymous attendee here, is related to that. How useful would it be to improve the pay and working conditions of typical feminised industries, as well as promoting women into typical masculised environments such as STEM, defence, etc.? And how can we prioritise this, and how might the Legislative Index help us do that?
Look, I think this is an excellent question. And I suppose one of the ways it can do that is in evaluating laws like the Workplace Gender Equality Act, and how they can do better in calling for gender disaggregated data that is also disaggregated by linguistic diversity and economic status. Because if we don't understand the problem, we can't properly address and design our solutions. I think in Australia, it's interesting because I mentioned it earlier and I didn't come to this point, which is the other reason why Australia ranks where we do in the Global Gender Gap Index, is on education. And we do have a very high, relatively high tertiary completion rate among women, but we're falling down because women are dominating those low paid and undervalued industries. And we know this, it's care, it's nursing, compared to engineering and the STEM industries. In fact, a recent study by the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Centre, released just last year on International Women's Day, said that of all the PhD graduates in computing science and artificial intelligence, only 20% are women. So we are failing women's future because women are not entering the industries that we know we'll need in the future, that will be valued and better paid. And some countries, remarkable countries like Morocco, a lot of countries in Latin America have parity in STEM. And so again, I think this is why we need to be looking overseas to find out what they're doing. And a lot of what they do is they educate early. They have quotas to get women into these industries, and they're working hard to change the image. So it's not just about better paying and valuing the work that women's doing, which 100% has to happen. We need to value these important industries, which is about well-being, the well-being of people that is in women's hands. But it's also about shifting the picture of women in STEM by educating, which means curriculum reform in Australia. So STEM actually happens at age 4 or 5 when we start early childhood education, and about changing the image so women feel welcome and safe in entering these industries and entering these careers. And until we do that, we're creating a future problem at the same time.
We have a long way to go in this country on that. We have amongst the most segregated labour market in the OECD, and while my own work at the moment is very focused on improving the pay and conditions for those feminised sectors, which are growing in terms of the size of their proportion of our economy. I think it's critical as well to say that there are other countries that we don't tend to look at that do this much better than we do, and that give women those opportunities and don't have nearly as much industrial segregation on gender lines.
And I think that's, it's, in all honesty, it's a hard conversation to have. I was born in Australia, educated here, and then left for nearly 11 years. And when I came back, I still had this sense that we are very proud as a nation because we have a wonderful country. It's a beautiful country and we're very privileged to live here, but it means we're also closed-minded to good practice overseas. And we're missing out. And when we do look for good practice, we are often looking for countries that we assume have a similar situation and demographic of ours. So for example, our Modern Slavery Act is an import from the UK. And because we do that, we're not looking to other countries that also have good practice models. And it's not about importing a model as it is. It's about learning from that practice and seeing what fits and might be the right solution in Australia from Latin America or Morocco, these countries that we would never turn to, but maybe in certain areas might be performing better than us.
Absolutely. And again, I'll say again, that is one of the real benefits of your book, I think, that asks us to look at our own region and look at countries we don't normally learn from. I'm just going to move away from audience questions for a minute because there's something that I wanted to discuss with you. There was a fascinating piece in the New York Times the other day by Susan Faludi, of course, who wrote the original Backlash, the Undeclared War against women, which I think was the late 80s. I remember being given it for my 18th birthday or maybe my 21st. And she was describing really the repeal of the constitutional right to abortion in America as the culmination of a long period of organised backlash against women's rights and and against feminism in the US. Have you seen in your research similar instances of such organised backlash in non-English speaking countries? And if so, what do you think causes that and how do we address it? Because I think we are at a time, we see it in Australia as well, where the rise of women's power and the rise of women's voice is fiercely resisted by a small group of very powerful men and some women as well. And that does seem to be a global phenomenon. Did you find similar occurrences of that in the Asian region?
Yes, and yes. I mean, I think that's very real. And not just in this region. It was, 10 years ago when I was heading the women's rights team, but actually 12 years ago now, where we mobilized in Turkey as activists from across the world to talk about religious fundamentalisms and fundamentalisms of all kinds, not just religious, and not just the religions that come to mind when you think about fundamentalisms, a diversity of religions and that fundamentalist drive that's undermining progress on women. And I think you can see that mobilized concerted backlash, sometimes, although not always, with this underlying religious influence. So in Indonesia, when President Megawati, she actually won the vote to become president, and there was a religious backlash against a Muslim majority nation having a woman leader, and fatwas were issued saying that a nation with a woman leader will fall down. And so she was actually denied the presidency despite having won the election. And it was only when dissatisfaction emerged with the President Wahid that she was able to step into the role. I mean, that's a perfect example of backlash against a woman leader and using her gender against her. And there were posters and protests from the young to the old saying, we can't have a female leader in this nation. In Sri Lanka very recently, prior to the fleeing of the current government, exiting from the role of government, there was a woman nominated to be the head of the police, so the police chief, the first ever female police chief in Sri Lanka. And there was a huge backlash that was inappropriate to have a female head of the police chief, that it just couldn't happen. And in fact, in response to that mobilized concerted backlash was the mobilizing of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus in her defense. And so in terms of strategies, I suppose that's all we can do is be prepared and mobilize back with strong evidence, good practice examples, and, will. Because the backlash is very real and very strong, and women need to be prepared and never assume that the good that we've obtained will be ours forever. And I think that's the sad thing about Roe. Having worked at the Center for Reproductive Rights in New York that took the case, I think it's an incredibly sad development in the US and global history, because countries that copy the US, Kenya and the Philippines, Mexico City, these countries will follow, and it will be a global backlash for women's rights that we will see as a result.
And related to that, this is the really fascinating question I want to ask you, and again, a question without notice, so forgive me. But the argument was very much about that this backlash is tied to the rise of celebrity feminism, particularly in America, but in the West. And there was a comparison made between the time that the Roe versus Wade decision was leaked, that the world's attention was focused on the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, the domestic, or the defamation trial. And that because the Me Too movement, which ironically, the term Me Too was a grassroots Black woman's movement in America originally. But because that hashtag movement became about powerful celebrity women calling out powerful celebrity men, that the failure or the apparent failure of the woman at the centre of that case, or her not being a good feminist or a good victim, has undermined feminism to some extent. And your book talks so powerfully about the importance of women's movements and grassroots movements to women's leadership. How do you see that play out similarly in the countries you studied, or is it a uniquely Western phenomenon that we've allowed feminism to be captured by this kind of celebrity approach?
Oh, look, I think, I think it is global, although in some respects it's very northern driven. I mean, I think there's a lot in what you've just said. And the first thing is to say that feminism is not necessarily a language that even resonates around the world. In Sinhala, in Sri Lanka, gender or gender studies and feminism, they just don't translate. And I think it's a reminder where we need to really listen to the grassroots women about their lived experiences and understand any country is not having a women's movement, but women's movements in all their diversity. And also, I think what you've described with Me Too, we've seen it for not just recently, but for decades. So after some of the audience might be familiar with the gang rape that took place on a bus in Delhi in 2010, and the woman went on to die after she was flown to Singapore for treatment. And there were protests across India. And before you knew it, it became the world's story and not just her story. And, there's a beautiful book that's come out. I'll give a shout out to a South African scholar of Indian origin, Srila Roy, whose book's called Changing the Subject. And it's about this depoliticization of India's women's rights movement because of Me Too. And so I think it is worth acknowledging that, I think these very well-intended global movements can then unintentionally serve to depoliticize and tear the heart out of some of these very local, very grassroots movements where women suddenly don't feel represented in the agenda anymore as it becomes a global one. It was similar to Michelle Obama, very well intended, talking about the kidnapping of young girls in northern Nigeria. These become global stories that then become appropriated and told for other purposes. And I think that's why, I really want to privilege in the book the role of women's movements in their plurality, conservative and progressive women's movements in the struggle for change, and to constantly keep talking about diversity of women leaders, diversity of movements, and diversity of the women that they're supposed to represent, because we aren't one monolithic category, and we need to be really nuanced when we have those conversations.
I've put a link to Srila Roy's book in the chat as well, if people want to have a look for that. And that lastly, that you mentioned diversity and the diversity among women. And I want to put to you this question, is that the issue of gender now is becoming quite contested, and it's not just about women or cis women. How does your gender legislative index or your approach to these issues grapple with that quite contested space, which can even at its most extreme ask us not to talk about women's issues anymore, but rather to talk about gender diversity? And yet we know that cis women have a different experience of gender oppression than do trans women, than do non-binary people. How do you envisage your index grappling with that increasingly contested space?
And I think it's really important to talk about that contested space. So the index is based on the Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And I've been able to use it as a tool to also challenge CEDAW and the convention for its binary approach. And I'm certainly far from the first scholar to do that. And I think this is the problem sometimes with human rights law. It requires everybody to fit into a category of discrimination. And then even then to fit even to further categories. So I'm discriminated against as a woman, not just as a woman of colour and of certain background. And so I think the index, I hope, and the research can seek to challenge those structures that are pushing on us this binary. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that the kinds of societal, socio-political and cultural norms that are pushing women into marginalised places, that are silencing certain women, that are leaving us out of the conversation, are the same sources that are discriminating against non-binary people. You know, this very patriarchal, male, frankly white structure and boxes that everyone is required to fit in, that leaves everybody else. And so I think there's value in understanding for the everybody else, the commonalities in our struggle and what we're fighting against, because it sounds incredibly cheesy as it's coming out of my mouth, but united, I think we're more effective than seeing ourselves as divided when we're up against common struggles.
We are, and that common struggle, as you said, is the white patriarchy, essentially, and they oppress all of us in many different ways. And I think one of the, thank you so much for your time. The book is an incredible read and has, as I said, a real depth of both qualitative and really innovative quantitative analysis. I think the fact that you have developed the index with machine learning helps to, or should enable us to remove some of those inherent biases that often come through in such analyses. So I just want to thank you so much for this important work and congratulate you on it. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to perhaps work together to get some of these measures adopted at both various state and federal government levels over coming years.
Thank you, Emma. Sounds wonderful. I'm certainly looking forward to that collaboration. And thank you again for hosting this really lovely discussion.
It's been fantastic to talk to you. And thank you so much, Ramona. I'm sure you'll all join me in welcoming her. And now, before I let you go, we will be having our next event on the 17th of August. It's a hybrid in-person and Zoom webinar event. And it's featuring this book, which is coming out next month, called Safety Net, The Future of Welfare in Australia. It's by Daniel Molino, who's a new, he's in the federal parliament now as a backbench MP. He is also a PhD macroeconomist from Yale. And this, again, is an incredibly well-researched and very thoughtful analysis of the welfare state and where it might be going next. If you're in Melbourne, you can join us for that in person at Graduate House for our monthly John Cain luncheon, but we will also be making the discussion available on Zoom as well. Please do stay in touch with Per Capita. As I said, both Ramona and I am very honoured to have been recently awarded a Women's Leadership Institute of Australia fellowship, and hope that I'll be working with Ramona and some of the other fantastic women that are in that program to take these ideas forward and to try to embed them in our national policy making and our legislative agenda. There's really no excuse now with a tool such as this to not apply a gender lens to all of our legislative processes. And as I said at the outset, if we can do that for competition and regional impact, we can certainly do it for gender, which is more than 50% of Australians out there that aren't certainly a hell of a lot more that aren't white men, but that aren't cis men. So thank you again, Ramona. Congratulations on your really important work. I'm really chuffed and a little bit imposter syndrome to be included on one of your abilities and passion and expertise in the fellowship program, but it is a really fantastic book and I encourage you all to go and check it out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. It's been lovely. Lovely talking to you.
And thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you hopefully on the 17th. Bye-bye.